Atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. On August 6, 1945, the city of Hiroshima became the first target of a nuclear weapon. A single American bomber, the Enola Gay, released a uranium-based bomb nicknamed Little Boy. The device detonated nearly 2,000 feet above the city. The blast was instantaneous. Heat reached several thousand degrees. The shockwave flattened neighborhoods in every direction. An estimated 70,000 people were killed instantly. Most of them were civilians. Thousands more were injured, burned, or trapped beneath rubble. Hospitals were destroyed. Medical staff were killed. Survivors received little treatment. In the days that followed, radiation sickness began to appear. People who seemed unharmed collapsed without warning. Hair fell out, bleeding started, fever spread. Entire families disappeared within weeks. 3 days later, on August 9, 1945, a second bomb was deployed, this time over Nagasaki. The weapon, a plutonium implosion device called Fat Man, detonated above a narrow valley. At least 40,000 people were killed immediately. Terrain limited some damage, but destruction was still widespread. Industrial zones, homes, and civilian shelters were erased. Radiation effects again followed. Deaths continued for months. The United States justified both attacks as acts of military necessity. An invasion of Japan had already been planned. Operation Downfall was expected to cause hundreds of thousands of casualties. American leaders argued the bombs would force surrender and save lives in the long run. Japan announced its surrender days after the second bombing. For many historians, this outcome supports the military necessity argument. Other historians disagree. They point to Japan's weakened position, the naval blockade, and the Soviet Union entering the war. Some argue the bombings were also a demonstration of power, a signal to the post-war world. Legal scholars later questioned whether the attacks violated the laws of war. Hague Conventions restricted the bombardment of civilian cities. Supporters argue Japan's cities were militarized. Critics argue civilian casualties were overwhelming. The debate remains unresolved. What is not disputed is the consequence. 2 cities were destroyed. Tens of thousands died instantly. Many more suffered long-term effects. The bombings introduced the world to nuclear warfare. They reshaped military strategy, international law, and moral boundaries. The atomic age had begun. Firebombing of Tokyo and other Japanese cities. On the night of March 9, 1945, Tokyo became a target of a new strategy. Hundreds of American bombers approached at low altitude under cover of darkness. They carried incendiary weapons, not high explosives, designed to ignite cities. Tokyo was built largely of wood, paper walls, tightly packed neighborhoods. The bombs fell in waves. Fires spread block by block. Wind fused them together. A firestorm formed. Temperatures soared beyond control. Oxygen vanished from streets. People suffocated while running. An estimated 100,000 civilians were killed in a single night. More than 1 million were left homeless. Entire districts were reduced to ash. This was Operation Meeting House. It was not an isolated strike. In the following months, the United States expanded the campaign. Osaka, Nagoya, Yokohama, Kobe. Dozens of cities were targeted. Incendiary bombing became the primary tactic. Military factories were embedded inside urban areas. Civilian homes surrounded them. The goal was disruption, industrial paralysis, psychological collapse. General Curtis LeMay directed much of the campaign. He openly stated the objective was destruction. Bombers flew lower to increase accuracy. Losses were accepted. Civil defense was overwhelmed. Air raid shelters failed. Fire crews could not respond. Water systems collapsed. Civilians fled into canals and rivers. Many drowned. Others boiled alive as fires consumed oxygen. By summer 1945, over 60 Japanese cities had been heavily damaged or destroyed. Millions were displaced. The United States framed the campaign as strategic necessity. Japan's war economy was decentralized. Factories were spread among neighborhoods. Precision bombing was ineffective. Area bombing was chosen instead. Supporters argued the campaign shortened the war. They claimed it weakened Japan's capacity to resist invasion. Critics raised legal concerns. International law restricted attacks on civilian populations. Defenders argued Japanese cities were legitimate targets due to total war mobilization. Opponents argued civilian suffering was disproportionate. The distinction between combatant and non-combatant had collapsed. After the war, LeMay himself acknowledged the legal ambiguity. He later stated that losing the war would have meant war crimes trials. No such trials occurred. The firebombing campaign remained largely overshadowed by the atomic bombings, yet its human toll was comparable, in some cases even greater. The destruction reshaped Japan's cities. It reshaped survivor memory. It reshaped moral debate. Firebombing demonstrated how modern war could erase entire populations without nuclear weapons. It revealed the cost of industrial warfare, and it left behind questions that history still struggles to answer. The Biscari Massacre. In July 1943, American forces landed in Sicily during Operation Husky. It was the Allied invasion of Axis-controlled Italy. The objective was clear: break Italian resistance, open a path into Europe. Near the town of Biscari, U.S. troops advanced inland under intense pressure. Combat was chaotic. Temperatures were extreme. Resistance was uneven. During the fighting, Italian and German soldiers attempted to surrender. What followed would later become known as the Biscari Massacre. In two separate incidents, American troops executed prisoners of war. They were unarmed. They were under custody. They posed no immediate threat. In the first incident, 36 Italian prisoners were shot and killed. In the second, German prisoners were lined up and executed. Some accounts describe the killings as retaliation. Others describe confusion and breakdown of discipline. Witnesses later testified that surrender had been clear. The Geneva Conventions explicitly protected prisoners of war. Execution without trial was prohibited. News of the killings reached senior commanders within days. Unlike many wartime incidents, this one was not ignored. The U.S. Army launched an investigation. 2 American soldiers were charged with murder. One soldier, Sergeant Horace West, was found guilty. He was sentenced to life imprisonment. Another officer, Captain John Compton, was acquitted. His defense argued he believed orders allowed the killing of prisoners. General George Patton, commander of 7th Army, played a controversial role. He reportedly downplayed the incident and criticized the prosecutions. Patton emphasized aggressive combat conduct and feared damage to morale. The trials revealed deep tensions within the Allied command: discipline versus brutality, orders versus law, victory versus accountability. The Biscari Massacre demonstrated that war crimes were not limited to defeated nations. They could occur within disciplined armies under extreme conditions. The U.S. military response was notable. Courts-martial were conducted, evidence was recorded, responsibility was debated. Some historians argue this showed accountability. Others argue punishments were inconsistent and lenient. The victims received little recognition. Their names were largely lost to history. The incident faded from public memory as the war continued, yet the case remains significant. It illustrates how quickly rules collapse under stress. It shows how leadership tone shapes battlefield behavior, and it proves that even victorious armies must confront their actions. The Biscari Massacre stands as a documented reminder: war does not suspend law, it tests it. Treatment of German POWs in the Rheinwiesenlager camps. In the spring of 1945, as Nazi Germany collapsed, millions of German soldiers surrendered to Allied forces. The United States suddenly held an unprecedented number of prisoners of war. To manage them, the U.S. Army established temporary detention camps along the Rhine River. These camps became known as the Rheinwiesenlager. They were open-air enclosures, barbed wire fences, no permanent shelters. Most prisoners slept on bare ground. Rain turned fields into mud. Exposure became routine. Food supplies were limited. Rations were reduced. Clean water was inconsistent. Medical care was minimal. Doctors were overwhelmed. Supplies ran short. The prisoners were classified not as prisoners of war, but as disarmed enemy forces. This legal distinction mattered. By changing the classification, the United States argued the Geneva Convention did not fully apply. As a result, inspection rights were limited. International oversight was reduced. Conditions deteriorated rapidly. Thousands suffered from malnutrition and disease. Dysentery spread through camps. Weak prisoners collapsed daily. Exact death numbers remain disputed. Some historians estimate several thousand deaths. Others argue the toll was much higher. The lack of precise records complicates the issue. U.S. officials at the time denied deliberate mistreatment. They cited logistical collapse, destroyed infrastructure, a devastated Europe. They argued resources were stretched thin by millions of displaced people. Supporters of this view frame the camps as an emergency response. Critics disagree. They argue the United States had sufficient resources but chose speed over care. They point to deliberate ration reductions and shelter restrictions. They also cite the refusal to recognize full POW status. Photographs from the camps show skeletal prisoners behind wire fences. Survivor testimonies describe hunger, cold, and despair. The camps were dismantled by late 1945. Most prisoners were released or transferred. No major war crimes trials addressed the Rheinwiesenlager. The issue faded from public discussion during the Cold War. For decades, the camps received little attention in mainstream histories. Modern scholars continue to debate responsibility. Was this negligence or unavoidable collapse? Was it legal improvisation or deliberate circumvention? There is no consensus. What is clear is the human cost. Men who had surrendered suffered suffered and died after the fighting ended. The Rheinwiesenlager challenge simple narratives of victory and justice. They remind historians that treatment of prisoners defines moral authority, and they show how legal choices shape human outcomes in war's aftermath. The Canicatti Massacre. In July 1943, American forces entered Sicily during the Allied invasion. The town of Canicatti had just been occupied by U.S. troops. Italian authority had collapsed. Civil order was fragile, food supplies were scarce. Local civilians gathered in a public square to demand bread. They were hungry, they were desperate, they were unarmed. American troops attempted to disperse the crowd. Tensions escalated quickly. Shouting filled the square. Control slipped away. A U.S. Army officer ordered fire. Machine guns opened up on the civilians. Men fell first. Women followed. Children were caught in the chaos. At least 8 civilians were killed instantly. Other estimates placed the number higher. Several more were wounded and left untreated. The crowd scattered. Bodies remained in the square. Fear spread through the town. The incident shocked witnesses. It occurred away from the front. There was no active combat, no immediate military threat. News of the killings reached American command shortly afterward. An internal investigation was conducted. The officer responsible was identified. He was found to have acted without proper justification. Unlike many incidents, this one resulted in formal accountability. The officer was relieved of command. He was later convicted by court-martial. The sentence was limited. The case received little public attention. The massacre was not publicized during the war. Military leaders feared damage to morale and public support. The Canicatti incident was quietly buried in official records. For decades, it remained largely unknown. Historians later revisited the case through declassified documents. They described it as a breakdown of discipline during occupation. Unlike battlefield killings, this involved civilians under military control. International law required protection of non-combatants in occupied territory. The shootings violated those principles. The victims were never memorialized. Their names faded from history. Their families received no justice. The Canicatti Massacre illustrates a different kind of crime, not chaos in battle, but violence during control. It shows how fear, stress, and authority can produce lethal decisions. Even far from the front, the incident stands as a reminder. Occupation carries responsibility. Power demands restraint. If you value clear history without hype, subscribe for future documentaries. Each video builds on evidence, not noise. New episodes explore overlooked moments that shaped the modern world together calmly.